Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Mia.
And I'm Daniel. Today we're diving into attitude, how it shapes perception, behavior, relationships, and even physical health. And importantly, how much of it is actually within our control.
Picture this. You're stuck in a massive, totally crowded airport terminal.
Oh, the worst.
Right. Your flight has just been delayed by like 6 hours. There is nowhere to sit. The Wi-Fi is just crawling and the coffee shop just closed.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Exactly. Now look at two passengers standing right next to each other in this exact scenario. The first person is gripping their rolling suitcase so hard their knuckles are white. I mean, their blood pressure's spiking, they're muttering curses, and they're basically gearing up to go yell at some exhausted gate agent.
Yeah, we've all seen that person.
We have. But right next to them, the second person just, takes a deep breath, shrugs, pulls a paperback out of their bag, and leans against a pillar to read.
Same delay, totally different reaction.
Exactly. It's the exact same difficult reality, but two completely different internal worlds, and ultimately, two completely different outcomes.
Because the difference between those two passengers isn't the external circumstance at all. The difference is the psychological lens they brought with them into that terminal.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are synthesizing a massive stack of research to figure out exactly how that lens works. We're pulling from clinical trial data on placebos, longitudinal relationship studies, cognitive behavioral frameworks, all to understand the psychology and the physical biology of attitude.
It's a huge topic.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the mechanisms of how your worldview actually bends reality, I think we need to clarify our terms. Because people use words like mood, personality, and attitude as if they're interchangeable, but they really aren't.
No, they're fundamentally distinct concepts, and understanding that distinction is really where your agency begins. So think of your mood like passing weather. It's temporary, it's often reactive. Thunderstorm rolls in, it rains, and then it clears up a few hours later. That is a mood.
Okay, so mood is weather. What about personality?
Personality is more like the climate of a region. It's a highly stable set of traits established over your entire lifetime. A desert is generally dry, a rainforest is generally wet.
Right, it's pretty fixed. So if mood is the weather and personality is the climate, attitude operates on a completely different axis entirely. The clinical definition in our sources describes attitude as a learned tendency, a tendency to evaluate things in a consistently positive or negative way.
The operative word there being learned.
Yes.
Learned, because attitude is a habit of interpretation rather than a fixed genetic trait. It is not this immovable part of who you are. It's an acquired cognitive reflex.
And because you learned it, you can basically question it, right?
Absolutely. You can examine it, deconstruct it, and systematically reshape it.
Which is huge. So if attitude is a learned framework, we need to understand exactly how we learn it in the, moment-to-moment trenches of daily life. And the research points heavily to attribution theory.
Right. Attribution theory. This is the framework of how we assign causes to the events we experience.
Right, because when something happens, the brain instantly demands to know why it happened.
Exactly. And the specific pattern you use to answer that why builds your overarching attitude. The habitual ways we explain success and failure basically dictate our future expectations.
So the source material categorizes these attributions along a few axes, primarily internal versus external, and permanent versus temporary.
Yes.
Let me try to use an analogy here. It's kind of like debugging a computer. Say your screen freezes up. Do you blame a temporary glitch, which is external and temporary, or do you just declare that the whole computer is garbage, which is internal and permanent?
That's a great way to put it. Let's apply that to the missed deadline example from the sources. Say you're at work and you miss a major project deadline. You have two primary ways to attribute that failure.
Right. You could view it as an external temporary event. Like maybe you interpret the missed deadline as a scheduling fluke because 3 other urgent tasks were dropped on your desk that week.
Exactly. Or you make an internal permanent attribution. You decide that you are fundamentally disorganized and perpetually terrible at managing time.
Which is pretty harsh.
It is. Now, the external reality, the fact that the deadline was missed, is identical in both scenarios. But the employee who makes the external temporary attribution views the failure as an anomaly.
So they maintain their confidence.
Right, they stay engaged. The employee who makes the internal permanent attribution, though, they internalize the failure as a fixed state. They approach their next project with hesitation, expecting to fail again.
And these quiet micro-judgments are happening constantly, right? Often totally below our conscious awareness. And over time, they compound into this rigid cognitive lens.
They absolutely do.
Which brings us to the concept of self-fulfilling prophecies. Because the way we interpret reality doesn't just sit passively in our minds. It actively influences external events. The Pygmalion effect is the classic demonstration of this.
Oh, this study is absolutely fascinating.
It's wild. So researchers went into an elementary school, gave the kids an assessment, and then they deliberately lied to the teachers.
Yeah, completely fabricated the results.
Right. They randomly selected a group of totally average students and told the educators, hey, our data shows these specific kids are on the verge of massive intellectual growth. They are highly gifted.
Even though they were just randomly picked from a hat.
Exactly. And at the end of the academic year, those randomly selected students had measurably outpaced their peers in actual academic performance.
It's incredible.
It is. The teacher's false expectation somehow became a physical reality. How does that even happen?
Well, the mechanism behind that transformation is entirely behavioral. It's rooted in the autonomic nervous system. The teachers didn't use magic to make the students smarter.
Right, obviously not.
But because they held the attitude that these students were brilliant, it unconsciously altered their microbehaviors. When one of these gifted students struggled to answer a question, the teacher's latency and response time increased.
Wait, latency? You mean they just waited longer?
Yes. They unconsciously waited just a fraction of a second longer, giving the student more time to think. Their facial microexpressions softened. They provided more nuanced feedback instead of just flatly correcting a mistake.
Oh, wow. So the teacher's internal attitude forced the external reality to bend just through thousands of these imperceptible behavioral shifts.
Exactly. And if we apply that to our own lives, it demonstrates how an attitude of chronic pessimism becomes a self-sealing loop.
Right. Because if you approach a difficult project already convinced it's going to fail, that attitude subtly alters your posture. It limits the questions you're willing to ask. It reduces your tolerance for frustration.
You end up manufacturing the exact failure you were afraid of.
It's so unsettling, but incredibly powerful. But, behavior is just the external manifestation. Let's look deeper. Does this psychological lens actually penetrate the skin? Like, are we seeing cellular changes based on attitude?
We absolutely are. We're looking at profound physiological alterations, specifically within the HPA axis.
That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right?
Yeah.
The one that controls our stress response.
That's the one. Chronic negative attitudes, where the brain is just constantly scanning for threats or interpreting ambiguous events as catastrophes, keep the body in a prolonged state of fight or flight.
So you're basically continuously bathing your system in cortisol and adrenaline.
Precisely. And over time, that chronic hormonal load weakens immune function, increases systemic inflammation, and even accelerates the shortening of telomeres.
And telomeres are the protective caps on our DNA linked to cellular aging, right?
Yes. But the inverse is just as biologically measurable. The clinical data links a constructive, optimistic attitude to lower levels of inflammatory markers, improved cardiovascular health, and a much more robust immune response.
So this isn't just some abstract positive thinking poster. This is the rigorous physiology of how the brain's expectation dictates the body's chemical environment.
Absolutely.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the clearest scientific demonstration of the brain's expectation commanding physical biology is the placebo effect.
Yes, the placebo effect is the perfect example here.
Right, where in clinical trials, patients are given an inert substance, like a sugar pill or a saline injection, but they're told it's a powerful medication. And a significant percentage experience actual quantifiable physical improvements.
But we need to be very precise here, because people often assume the placebo effect just means the patient thinks they feel better.
Right, or like they're just underreporting their symptoms to please the researcher in a white coat.
Exactly. But the data shows something much deeper than that. It shows actual physiological modulation.
Really, like measurable changes in the body.
Yes. When we look at functional MRI scans of patients experiencing the placebo effect for pain relief, we see decreased activity in the brain's pain processing centers, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex.
Wow, so the brain actually stops processing the pain as much.
Right. The brain's expectation that a painkiller has been administered prompts the central nervous system to release its own endogenous opioids. the body's natural painkillers.
So the attitude of expectation literally commands the body's internal pharmacy to just, initiate a healing process.
Exactly. It's a biological command.
Okay, so if the mind can exert that level of command over the body, we have to look at the reverse pathway. What about embodied cognition? The theory suggests that our physical body can dictate our internal attitude, like the idea that if you slouch, your attitude worsens, but if you sit up straight, you feel more capable.
So, embodied cognition is a highly nuanced field. I have to acknowledge that some of the most famous studies in this area, particularly regarding power posing, have faced pretty severe replication challenges.
Right. It's not quite a magic bullet. I appreciate that you're highlighting that. It's a really honest, hype-free way to look at this pop psychology stuff.
Thanks. We cannot treat posture as a biological hack to just instantly cure profound insecurity. However, the foundational principle of a bidirectional feedback loop between the body and mind does remain intact.
Right, because of the vagus nerve?
Exactly. The vagus nerve continuously relays proprioceptive feedback from your organs and muscles back to your brain. Taking a slow, deep breath or adopting an open, relaxed posture sends a physical signal to your autonomic nervous system that you are not currently under threat.
So that physical baseline of safety essentially supports the cognitive generation of a more constructive attitude.
You've got it. It sets the stage for a better mindset.
Okay, so we've mapped how this rewires your internal cellular biology, but you don't exist in a vacuum. What happens when your attitude collides with someone else's?
That's where we get into emotional contagion.
Right. The sources really delve into this, showing how attitudes spread completely invisibly across social networks and workplaces.
And the transmission mechanism for emotional contagion relies heavily on our mirror neuron system and autonomic synchronization.
How does that work in practice, like in an office?
Well, when you interact with a highly stressed, pessimistic coworker, your brain is unconsciously registering their furrowed brow, the elevated pitch of their voice, their rigid body language.
And your own nervous system just naturally begins to mimic those physical states.
Yes, which in turn triggers a matching psychological state. You can literally absorb the physiological stress of a colleague without ever exchanging a single word about the actual problem.
That is wild. And this contagion effect becomes even more pronounced in long-term relationships, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The longitudinal relationship studies in our sources, the ones tracking couples over decades, reveal that conflict is an inevitability. Disagreement is just a baseline requirement when two individuals share a life.
Sure. But the ultimate predictor of whether a partnership will actually survive isn't the frequency of the arguments, right? It's the underlying attitude brought into the conflict.
That's exactly right. The data contrasts an attitude of goodwill against an attitude of contempt.
And contempt is basically the death knell.
Contempt is the most corrosive element in a relationship precisely because of what it communicates. Couples who approach disagreements with an attitude of goodwill, they still fight, but they maintain a baseline of mutual respect.
Right.
When the attitude shifts to contempt, which is characterized by eye-rolling sarcasm or this underlying tone of superiority,
it signals to the partner that they are fundamentally defective.
Exactly. Contempt breaks the core attachment bond and triggers a severe threat response. That makes it the single most accurate predictor of an eventual breakup.
And I imagine that dynamic scales up directly to leadership and organizational behavior too.
Without a doubt. A leader's attitude during a crisis functions as a shared resource for the entire team or a shared burden.
Right. If a manager panics, catastrophizes, brings an attitude of blame to a project failure, they just dysregulate the entire team's nervous system.
Completely. Conversely, a leader who brings an attitude of steady, solutions-oriented resilience helps regulate the group, allowing them to maintain the cognitive bandwidth they actually need to solve the problem.
And we see the exact same mechanism in childhood development, right?
Oh, heavily. Kids don't learn attitude from verbal lectures about resilience.
Right. They don't care what you say.
Exactly. They rely on observational learning. They are constantly monitoring the adults in their environment, absorbing the habitual ways you react to losing your keys, getting cut off in traffic, or, navigating a financial setback.
So they just adopt your attitudinal baseline as their own template for reality.
Exactly.
Which really frames the management of your own attitude not just as some personal self-care routine, but as a genuine public service. Keeping your biological and psychological lens in check is a service you provide to your team, your partner, and your children.
It really is a responsibility.
But that brings us to the operational challenge. Since attitude is contagious and incredibly powerful, how do we actively change it without just, faking a smile when things are objectively awful?
Right, because our culture heavily promotes the idea of simply looking on the bright side.
Which the research suggests is actually quite harmful.
Yes, forcing a cheerful facade over genuine distress is referred to as toxic positivity, and it is psychologically counterproductive.
So if I tell someone who has just experienced a profound loss that everything happens for a reason, is that toxic positivity?
Yes, because you are invalidating their reality. The psychological mechanism at play here relates to ironic process theory. When you actively suppress negative emotions, the cognitive effort required to maintain that suppression actually increases your internal allostatic load.
Wait, so the negative emotion doesn't just go away?
No, it doesn't dissipate at all. It intensifies and often manifests physiologically.
Wow. So a healthy attitude is not synonymous with forced positivity. It's about realistic resilience.
Exactly. It's the capacity to look at a devastating situation and honestly acknowledge the pain, while still maintaining the belief in your own capacity to handle it.
So practically speaking, how do we build that resilience?
One of the most practical tools comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive reframing.
Okay, cognitive reframing. This is the disciplined practice of intercepting an automatic negative thought and actively evaluating it for accuracy, right?
Yes. The goal is cognitive flexibility, breaking the habit of immediately accepting your absolute worst-case scenario as the truth.
Let's walk through this with an example. The CBT frameworks use the unanswered message scenario. Say you send a text to a close friend, and they leave you on read for 6 hours.
A classic anxiety trigger.
Right. If your habitual attribution is internal and permanent, your automatic thought is, they are angry with me, I must have done something wrong, our friendship is over.
But reframing doesn't mean you pivot to a toxically positive assumption. You don't say, oh, they're probably just busy planning a surprise party for me.
Right, that's just delusional.
Exactly. Instead, you emphasize accuracy. You consciously list alternative explanations based in reality.
Like they're in back-to-back meetings, their phone battery died, or they opened the message while driving and just forgot to reply.
Yes. And by consciously generating those alternatives, you interrupt the threat response in your amygdala.
So you prevent the release of stress hormones over an entirely fabricated scenario.
Right. And you maintain a baseline of emotional neutrality until you have actual data.
I love that. But while cognitive reframing works for a lot of people, I want to highlight a really fascinating counterpoint from the sources. This is from the research of psychologist Julie Norum on defensive pessimism.
Oh, yes. This is a crucial caveat.
Because we often assume that an optimistic frame is the universal gold standard for everybody, but Norum found that for naturally anxious people, deliberately imagining negative outcomes actually reduces anxiety and improves performance.
Right. For a specific subset of the population, anticipating failure lowers their cognitive load.
How does that work? Why wouldn't it just make them more anxious?
By vividly imagining what could go wrong, like a flight cancellation or a technology failure during a presentation, they can actively plan contingencies. And once the contingency is in place, the anxiety dissipates.
And that allows them to actually execute their tasks effectively. It's so interesting because it proves there is no single correct attitude template for everyone.
Exactly. The objective is to identify the cognitive strategy that best allows you to take constructive action in reality.
Speaking of reality, I think we need to zoom out to the macro level. We need to place a hard boundary on what attitude can actually accomplish. Because isn't it a bit reductive or even irresponsible to suggest that a good attitude solves systemic poverty or serious illness?
I validate that deeply.
Yeah.
It is incredibly dangerous to treat attitude as a magical cure-all. Overstating the power of psychological framing inevitably leads to victim blaming.
Right. If we insist that attitude creates all outcomes, we're basically telling people suffering under devastating structural realities that their condition is their own fault, just because they lacked the proper mindset.
Exactly. Psychological agency dictates how you experience and navigate your circumstances, but it does not replace the need for real support or structural change. Mindset is a critical tool for survival, but it cannot replace medical intervention, financial resources, or systemic reform.
Okay, I'm glad we established those boundaries. But within the realm of what we can control, there is immense hope in the science of neuroplasticity. Because I can imagine someone listening to this, recognizing they've been a pessimist their whole life and thinking, well, is it too late? Am I just hardwired this way?
That's a very common fear.
Yeah.
But the research on neuroplasticity confirms that the brain remains malleable throughout your entire life. It is never too late.
That's incredibly encouraging.
The foundational rule of neuroplasticity is Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together. If you've spent 30 years making pessimistic attributions, those specific neural pathways are heavily myelinated.
So they act like cognitive superhighways. Your thoughts just travel down them rapidly and effortlessly.
Yes, but you have the biological capacity to construct new pathways.
Right. So every time you pause to question an automatic negative thought, and every time you practice cognitive reframing, you're forcing a new sequence of neurons to fire.
And initially, this requires immense conscious effort. It feels clunky and slow.
But over time, with sustained repetition, that new cognitive trail undergoes myelination. It becomes faster and more efficient, while the old pessimistic highway gradually degrades through lack of use.
Exactly. And furthermore, you can actually accelerate that rewiring process through the mechanism of cognitive dissonance.
Wait, how does cognitive dissonance help here?
Well, you do not have to wait until you feel optimistic to change your attitude. Action frequently precedes feeling.
Okay, so you change the behavior first.
Oh, yes. When you engage in a behavior that contradicts your internal attitude, like methodically preparing for a meeting, even when you feel totally cynical about the outcome, your brain experiences psychological friction.
And to resolve that internal conflict, the brain will frequently just adjust its internal attitude to align with the external behavior.
Exactly. You can literally act your way into a new mindset.
We have covered immense ground today. We've examined how our habitual attributions build our reality, how expectations alter our physical biology, down to our inflammatory markers.
We covered emotional contagion, how our mood invisibly infects our social circles and our kids.
And how we can actively rewrite our brains through reframing and neuroplasticity. So what does this all mean?
It leads to a singular conclusion. The circumstances of the world happen to you, but your attitude is created by you. It's a learned biological and psychological lens. And because you are the one constructing it, you possess the lifelong authority to rebuild it.
That is beautifully said. Building directly on that realization about how our framing dictates our reality, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to consider. We operate in a modern attention economy where algorithms, news feeds, and social media platforms are constantly systematically engineered to frame information in a way that harvests your attention and your outrage.
You absolutely are.
Entire industries profit by artificially priming your nervous system for a reactive, pessimistic attitude. So given that structural reality is taking conscious, deliberate control of your own psychological lens no longer just a matter of self-improvement, is it actually the ultimate act of modern rebellion? Think back to that crowded, chaotic airport terminal. The delay, the crowds, the broken Wi-Fi might be entirely out of your control. But the lens you choose to view it through, the attitude that dictates your biology and your behavior, that belongs exclusively to you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Examine the lens you are wearing today and ponder how a deliberate adjustment might rewrite your reality. We'll see you next time.
If this episode genuinely helped you, subscribe for more English learning podcasts like this one and leave a comment telling us what's one situation in your life right now where a small shift in attitude might genuinely change the outcome.
We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.